Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever loved someone so deeply only to feel like you're the only one holding the relationship together? What if I told you the moment an empath stops chasing, the avoidant begins to crumble? This isn't just a love story, it's a silent war between presence and avoidance, between healing and hiding. And in that silence, the empath's strength becomes the avoidant's reckoning. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see love, power, and emotional survival forever. There comes a moment in every empath's life when they finally stop trying to earn someone's love and begin to understand their own value. It's a moment that feels less like a dramatic explosion and more like a quiet decision, deep, still, and undeniable. After pouring themselves into a connection, trying to decode every mixed signal and silence, the empath wakes up to the realization that their love should not be a performance for approval. They recognize that constantly chasing after someone who keeps pulling away is not a form of devotion, it's self-abandonment. And when that clarity hits, something powerful shifts within them. They don't lash out. They don't send a long message begging for clarity. They just stop. And in that silence, the dynamic between them and the avoidant begins to change in ways the avoidant never anticipated. For a long time, the avoidant thrives in control, subtle, emotional control. They get used to the empath doing all the emotional labor. The empath initiates the conversations, holds space for their mood swings, and patiently waits during emotional absences. This imbalance becomes routine, almost expected. But when the empath stops chasing, when they no longer rush to fill the voids created by the avoidant's distance, it causes a disruption, not in the form of chaos, but in the form of stillness. And for someone who is used to controlling connection through detachment, stillness feels like loss. The avoidant doesn't know how to name this feeling at first, but they notice the absence of attention, the absence of validation, and the lack of emotional cushioning they once took for granted. The empath has not become cold or cruel, they've become conscious. They finally understand that their emotional generosity was being poured into a cup with no bottom. And rather than blaming the avoidant, they make a different choice. They conserve their energy. They reinvest in themselves, and they let silence do what words never could. This is not revenge, it's realignment. It's the recognition that staying in a space where your heart is constantly tested is not strength, it's self-neglect. So they withdraw, not with drama, but with dignity. And that absence begins to echo in places the avoidant didn't even know were hollow. They start to miss the presence that used to ground them, even though they never fully received it when it was there. The avoidant, who once held the power by keeping the empath emotionally off balance, now feels a strange instability, but this time it's not caused by the empath's neediness. It's caused by their detachment. They begin to wonder why the messages have stopped, why the check-ins are no longer sent, why the emotional safety net seems to have disappeared. They may even try to test the waters, drop a casual text, offer a half-hearted compliment, or subtly hint at reconnection. When they feel distrust, they trust reassurance more because it provides a long-term support that restores emotional safety and the previous relationship. But the empath no longer responds in the old way. They're not cruel, they're just clear. That old pull, that emotional hook, it's gone. And the avoidant starts to feel something rare for them, the sting of emotional consequence. This is where the ego begins to crack. Because avoidants often build an identity around being desired, but not needing anyone. They enjoy the emotional upper hand, even if subconsciously. But when the empath stops playing their part in that silent dance, the avoidant is left standing alone, still distant, but now unchased. They're no longer the mysterious figure being decoded. They're just a person alone with their walls. And those walls, once their protection, now feel like a prison. The ego that thrived on being needed starts to feel fragile, exposed. Because it's not that the empath doesn't feel anymore, it's that they've outgrown the need to prove their love to someone who resists it. As the empath redirects their energy inward, they begin to glow differently. There's a peace in them now, a self-assuredness that doesn't need external validation. They realize that they were never too much. Their love was just too pure for someone who couldn't hold it. And with this realization, they stop watering dead plants. The avoidant may sense this shift not through confrontation, but through absence. The kind of absence that makes you question everything. The avoidant begins to feel the imbalance in reverse. They are now the ones wondering, reaching, even if quietly. And this reversal is deeply uncomfortable. For someone who used to feel safer on emotional autopilot, the empath's silence becomes a mirror, reflecting everything the avoidant tried to avoid, not because the empath intends to hurt them, but because truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It just needs to stop hiding. And in this new dynamic, the avoidant is faced with a choice: grow or retreat. Some will attempt to re-engage, using old patterns masked as curiosity or concern. But the empath, now more aware, doesn't fall for breadcrumbs. They've learned to require more than potential. They look for consistency, accountability, and emotional reciprocity. If that's not offered, they keep walking. Not out of bitterness, but out of respect for their own peace. It's important to understand that this isn't about making the avoidant suffer. It's about the empath finally choosing themselves. They've spent so long analyzing, adapting, and anticipating someone else's needs that they forgot to ask, what about mine? And once they ask that question and answer it, they stop sacrificing themselves for partial love. They realize that emotional connection should never feel like a maze. It should feel like safety, mutuality, and truth. And anything less is not love, it's a lesson. The avoidant, if self-awares, may begin their own healing journey. But that's no longer the empath's job to oversee. The beauty in all of this is that the empath doesn't need revenge or validation. Their healing becomes their closure, their peace becomes their statement, and the avoidant, whether they acknowledge it or not, begins to feel the weight of what they lost, not just the person, but the emotional nourishment they never learned to receive. In that silence, the ego they once used to protect themselves begins to crumble. Because deep down, even avoidants want to be loved. They're just terrified of the intimacy that love requires. And when that love is no longer available, they are left to confront what their distance has cost them. So the story isn't about who wins, it's about who wakes up. The empath wakes up to their own worth. The avoidant, if they're willing, wakes up to their own fear. And in the end, the power belongs not to the one who controls through detachment, but to the one who reclaims their emotional freedom. The empath doesn't destroy the avoidant's ego out of vengeance. They dismantle it simply by no longer feeding it. The real transformation happens in the silence, in the space where the empath finally chooses peace over proving, and where the avoidant is left with nothing but their reflection. There comes a point when the empath, once deeply entangled in someone else's emotional chaos, steps back and sees clearly for the first time, not because the avoidant changed, but because the empath did. They no longer see themselves as the healer or fixer, and in that shift, everything changes. Where once they would stretch their soul thin trying to mend the disconnect, they now stand still and observe. Instead of trying to decode mixed signals, they begin to understand that those signals are a reflection of wounds that aren't theirs to carry. This quiet understanding doesn't come from anger, it comes from growth. The empath stops trying to medicate the avoidant's emotional wounds with their affection. Instead, they become a mirror, silently reflecting the truth of the dynamic. And the avoidant, for the first time, sees the emptiness they've been trying to hide from in someone else's eyes. When someone is avoidant, they've likely spent much of their life building defense mechanisms that help them feel safe from emotional vulnerability. They create distance not because they don't feel, but because feeling deeply terrifies them. Intimacy, to them, feels like exposure. So they armor themselves with aloofness, sarcasm, or detachment. But when faced with a strong, grounded empath who no longer absorbs their pain, their usual tactics stop working. The empath no longer bends under emotional pressure or begs for closeness. They offer space, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. And that space becomes the very thing the avoidant cannot navigate, because for the first time, they are confronted with themselves instead of the empath's effort to fix what was never theirs to fix. This moment is uncomfortable for both people, but it's transformative. The empath, who once confused love with overgiving, finally sets down the weight of someone else's emotions. And the avoidant, who relied on the empath's emotional labor to avoid their own, suddenly feels the vacuum. When the empath was trying to fix, the avoidant could continue avoiding. But now, with no one doing the emotional heavy lifting, they are left with the raw truth of their own disconnection. The silence of the empath isn't cold, it's reflective. It says, "I see you, but I no longer shrink for you." And that quiet power has a way of breaking down walls far more effectively than words ever could. For avoidance, being seen is both a longing and a fear. They crave connection but don't know how to exist inside it without feeling suffocated. So they push people away just to feel in control. But the empath who has healed no longer reacts to these emotional games. They don't chase after the disappearing act or beg for reassurance. They stay grounded in their energy, allowing the avoidant to witness the impact of their emotional absence. This is not manipulation, it's accountability. The empath is no longer softening the truth to maintain the illusion of harmony. They simply allow the avoidant to face the natural consequences of pushing love away. The avoidant begins to feel discomfort, not because they're being punished, but because the mirror the empath holds is now clear and unwavering. It reflects the emotional distance, the hot and cold behavior, the inability to receive love fully. And for someone who has spent years avoiding their own vulnerability, this reflection can feel threatening. But in truth, it's the first step toward awareness. The ego, which once protected them, starts to unravel under the weight of their own emotional inaccessibility. And what they begin to feel is not rejection, it's the absence of their own capacity to connect. The empath's shift doesn't wound them. It reveals the wounds they've long denied. The beauty in the empath's transformation is that they no longer try to be the salve for someone else's pain. They stop apologizing for having needs. They stop over-explaining, over-giving, over-compensating. And by doing so, they hold up a quiet, powerful mirror that says, if this love cannot flow both ways, I'm no longer staying here. This type of reflection cannot be argued with. It isn't confrontational, it's factual. And the avoidant, for perhaps the first time, begins to see the cost of their avoidance. Not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, dawning awareness that the connection they once took for granted is slipping away, not because the empath stopped loving, but because they started loving themselves more. Avoidants often fear being judged or exposed emotionally, but in front of a healed empath there is no judgment, only truth. And truth, when reflected clearly, can feel like fire. Not because it harms, but because it burns away the ego's defenses. The avoidant may try to re-engage, to pull the empath back into the familiar dynamic, but it no longer works. The empath has changed frequency. They no longer respond to inconsistency, to emotional breadcrumbs, to confusion disguised as mystery. They require clarity, presence, and accountability. Anything less feels like regression, and the avoidant is left to face a reality where love does not mean being endlessly pursued. What happens next is up to the avoidant. Some will retreat further, unable to face their own emotional reflection. Others, shaken by the mirror, will begin to question themselves in ways they never have before. They may, for the first time, look at their own avoidance not as protection, but as a limitation. They may begin to understand that pushing people away doesn't make them stronger, it just keeps them alone. And if they are willing to grow, that mirror the empath held becomes a turning point. But that path is theirs to walk. The empath is no longer waiting on the sidelines, hoping for change. They've already moved forward. The silent power of the empath is not in what they say or do, it's in what they no longer tolerate. That quiet shift forces others to step into their own accountability or be left behind. The avoidant might feel like the empath destroyed their ego, but the truth is, the empath simply stopped protecting it. They stopped playing small to preserve the other person's comfort. And in that space, all the avoidant is left with is a choice: confront their own fear of connection or remain hidden behind walls that no longer serve them. Either way, the empath is no longer inside the maze. They've chosen the exit, chosen peace, chosen self-respect. It's time to reimagine the world as it should be. And in 17th century England, as in Britain, nobody remained inside the maze. They stood on the outside, chosen peace, chosen self-respect. This isn't a war of power, it's a reclamation of truth. The empath, by becoming the mirror, doesn't fight the avoidant. They allow them to see themselves. And in a world full of people running from reflection, that is the most radical form of love. Love that tells the truth without flinching. Love that doesn't rescue, but reveals. Love that says, I see your fear, but I won't carry it for you. In doing so, the empath frees themselves and offers the avoidant a rare chance to face the one person they've been hiding from all along, themselves. There comes a turning point in an empath's life when they stop asking, why won't they love me the way I love them, and begin asking, is this even love at all? That shift doesn't happen in an instant. It builds quietly over time. It builds through every unanswered message, every emotional withdrawal, every moment when the empath had to convince themselves that crumbs were a feast. Slowly, they begin to realize that love shouldn't be earned through suffering, that emotional availability isn't something that should be begged for. They learn that it's not their responsibility to prove they are worthy of someone who doesn't even know how to receive love. And in that awakening, the empath begins to reframe what love really means, not as sacrifice, but as mutual recognition, not as pain, but as peace. Empaths are naturally generous. They feel deeply, love deeply, and want deeply to connect. But when that desire for connection is met with avoidance, silence, or cold detachment, they often turn that pain inward. They think, maybe if I loved harder, maybe if I was more patient, maybe if I changed myself. But emotional intimacy isn't built on effort alone. It's built on reciprocity. And when the empath begins to see that their efforts are only being met with resistance or emotional evasion, they start to question the dynamic. It's not that they stop loving, it's that they stop self-abandoning. They stop offering their soul as a remedy to someone who hasn't even acknowledged the wound. This shift marks the beginning of their emotional evolution. With clarity comes standards, real standards, not just surface-level lists, but deep, soul-level boundaries. The empath begins to ask different questions. Do they have the capacity to meet me where I am? Can they offer presence, not just proximity? Can they hold space for vulnerability without fleeing from it? These questions are not meant to shame the other person, but to protect the empath's own peace. Because love that constantly asks you to wait, prove, or chase is not love, it's survival. And the empath, once addicted to potential, begins to require presence. They no longer fall for the fantasy of what someone could be. They want who someone is right now with honesty and emotional maturity. As they grow stronger, the empath no longer views boundaries as threats to love, but as expressions of self-love. They don't threaten to leave to gain power, they simply know they will, if necessary, to preserve their well-being. And that knowing becomes their calm. They don't beg, plead, or perform. They speak their truth, and if it's not honored, they walk away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. This new energy is unsettling to someone who was used to the empath doing all the emotional work. Because when the empath stops over-permissioning, the imbalance becomes painfully obvious. The avoidant can no longer hide behind the empath's effort. Avoidants, who often rely on control through detachment, start to feel a kind of emptiness in this new dynamic. They used to feel secure, knowing the empath would always be there, would always try harder, would always stay, even when their needs weren't met. But when that changes, when the empath chooses themselves over the pattern, the avoidant is left to confront a truth they've long avoided. Connection requires vulnerability, not dominance, not withdrawal, not emotional evasion. The ego may flare, it may protest, but underneath it is the fear of being truly seen. And now there's no buffer to hide behind. The empath has stepped out of the storm. This doesn't mean the empath stops caring. If anything, they care more deeply now. But they also care for themselves. They've learned that love isn't about losing yourself to keep someone else. It's about meeting in the middle, with open hands and open hearts. They stop giving where there's no receiving. They stop twisting themselves to fit into spaces too small for their truth. And in doing so, they set a new standard. Not just for how others treat them, but for how they treat themselves. They become the protector of their energy, not the sacrifice for someone else's healing. This inner shift creates external ripple effects. The avoidant, once in control, now feels unanchored. They may try to test the waters, reach out subtly, offer surface-level charm, or attempt to reel the empath back in, but none of that works anymore. The empath no longer responds to emotional bait. They require depth. They require effort. They require more than an apology. They require action. And if that's not offered, they don't engage. This isn't a game. It's not punishment. It's clarity. It's the recognition that peace is not something to be traded for someone else's inconsistency. And the empath finally realizes they deserve more than almost love. This transformation is not about superiority, it's about sovereignty. The empath is no longer ruled by the hope that one day, maybe, things will change. They see clearly now. They see that emotional labor must be shared, that love must feel safe, and that connection without consistency is just confusion. So they create a new reality, one where their standards are not negotiable, one where their heart is no longer a landing pad for unavailable people. They hold space for love, but only if it comes with presence, safety, and truth. Anything less is no longer enough. The avoidant may not understand this at first. They may think the empath became cold or detached. But the truth is, the empath finally found balance. They finally stopped seeing love as something to prove and started seeing it as something to experience, mutually. They no longer chase, fix, or explain their worth. They know who they are, and in that knowing, they create space only for those who also know how to show up fully. Those who don't, they're free to walk away. Because the empath is no longer waiting, they're living. This new version of the empath is not harder. They're wiser, they're not bitter, they're boundaried, they're not closed off, they're careful. They know that their heart is still open, but it's no longer wide open to everyone. It's protected, cherished, and sacred. They've seen what happens when they give too much to someone who isn't ready, and they've chosen to break that cycle, not out of spite, but out of self-honor. They finally understand that love shouldn't hurt this much, and they refuse to carry the emotional weight for two anymore. So they walk differently now. They speak more gently to themselves. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They no longer confuse attachment with love. And they no longer confuse emotional labor with connection. They are still deeply feeling, deeply giving, deeply loving, but only where love lives in return. The avoidant, if ready, may meet them there, but if not, the empath will keep moving forward. No longer desperate to be chosen, but committed to choosing themselves every single time.